All right, so today we're going to be talking about your FA2 task and what you actually need to do. So the task asks you to write a literary essay for a magazine called The Conversation. So they're running a special edition called How the Lessons of Literature Endure Today. So what you need to do is analyze how one concept is represented across two different texts, so your novel and your film. Depending on what class you're in, you'll be doing a different film, but you've all done the same novel, which is To Kill a Mockingbird. So you need to pick a concept: prejudice, courage, or innocence. And the important thing is you need to analyze how the concept is represented in each text. It is not a compare and contrast. You can obviously draw some similarities between the two texts, but that is not the purpose. The purpose is to analyze how the concept is represented, so how it's actually appearing in the text. You also need to link it to how these lessons that we learn in this literature are still relevant today. They still last. It still stands the test of time. So, for example, if you're talking about To Kill a Mockingbird and you're talking about The Help, you might be discussing how prejudice is still relevant today. Okay, and you'll make links through that throughout your literary essay. Now, in order to have your own voice, which is what is required of you, you need to contribute to the conversation, so to the discussion around why these lessons are still important. You need to have your own perspective on the issue. So that means that you need to have a perspective about how prejudice, courage, or innocence are represented in both of the texts. Now, in order to do that, you also need to have another linking big idea. So what that means is if you are looking at, say, the concept of courage, you would look at how courage is represented in To Kill a Mockingbird, and you would also look at how courage is represented in your film. For my class, we're doing The Help. In order to have my own perspective on that, I would also look at how is the opposite represented. So yes, there's tons of courage in both the texts, but what about cowardice as well? So I would look at, if for an example, I might decide, right, I'm going to look at how the characters in The Help and To Kill a Mockingbird, there's two characters in particular that I think show a lot of courage. In To Kill a Mockingbird, we've got Atticus, and in The Help, we have either Skeeter, Aibileen, or Minnie. You can pick whichever one you like. So I would write about how those characters show courage, and then I would draw comparisons to the other side and talk about how there are characters who show cowardice. So cowardice could be characters that choose to ignore racism or prejudice or whatever is going on in their town. So, for example, cowardice, you might choose for To Kill a Mockingbird, Mayella, because she is a bit of a coward where she doesn't actually admit her fault in hitting on or approaching Tom Robinson. Instead, she pretends that she was raped by him and she allows him to go through the injustice of being accused of that, knowing full well that he will likely go to jail or die because of that false accusation. So she is a coward. She's a good example of a coward. In The Help, another person who's a coward could be the character of Elizabeth, who sees the poor treatment of the maids and the African people in her community, and she stands by and does nothing about it. In particular, she stands by when Hilly fires Aibileen. So what I've got there is I've got my concept. Okay, my concept would be courage. I would also have my linking big idea would be cowardice. And obviously, I'm talking about this within the context of prejudice, because every idea that you talk about in these texts are relating to prejudice, because let's face it, both texts are fundamentally about prejudice. Remember, Prejudice is not just racism. Prejudice is to prejudge, to judge somebody based on a particular aspect or trait. So, for example, there could be prejudice in terms of social status, prejudice in terms of race, prejudice in terms of gender roles. So, there's a lot of prejudice in here. So, if you're talking about courage and cowardice, you might make it specific to race, okay? And the people who are willing to stand up and do the right thing despite the social norms of the time, despite the expectations, values, and beliefs of the society, versus the people who show cowardice, the people who don't stand up, and the people who are bystanders, who go along with the social norms and the expectations, knowing that morally and ethically, some of the things that are happening, you can actually see those characters are uncomfortable with it, but they remain silent. So that would be what my linking big idea would be. And obviously, then I have a voice here, right? I have plenty to talk about. So remember, we still need to relate it back to today. Relating it back to today is looking at how people are still displaying courage in the face of adversity or in the face of prejudice or racism. We could also even look at how people are displaying cowardice in the face of racism or prejudice in today's world. There's plenty of examples. One example off the top of my head is the Black Lives Matter movement. There is some courage displayed, whereas you've got cowardice with, the examples, any examples of racial prejudice or gender stereotyping or whatever you're talking about in the news today. All you need to do is very briefly link to those things throughout your body paragraphs. So a sentence or two, making an observation of how something is similar to today or relates to today. So in your main body paragraphs, you can have either one main point, two main points, or three main points. If I'm looking at one main point, okay, this main point would be about courage. Okay, this main point would be where I would talk about To Kill a Mockingbird and the particular character that show the two characters that show, or the one character that shows courage. And then I would go on to, in the same paragraph, the character that shows courage as well. So this whole main point is going to be all about courage, and it'll talk about both the texts, right? So I would be talking about Atticus, and then I would be talking about Skeeter as both being courageous because they're easy to pick. Now, the important thing is when you are picking your evidence to show how these characters show courage, you need to pick evidence that has some sort of aesthetic or stylistic feature. Now, you have a list of aesthetic and stylistic devices, but just for a brief example, you might be looking at a piece of dialogue written by Atticus. So it could be the speech from the final trial, whereas in that, there is one particular quote that he emphasizes the word all about 4 times. So he says, not all Negroes are liars, not all Negroes are thieves, not all Negroes are cheats, etc., etc. So the italics emphasizes, right? So therefore, that is a stylistic device that is used on purpose by the author to emphasize the word all. Okay, and they emphasize the word all because Atticus is pointing out you can't just generalize everybody as being the same because of the color of their skin. So in that evidence, I'm talking about Atticus being courageous because he's pointing something out that is not highlighted in their society at the time. I'm choosing the evidence because it's also got a stylistic device, and I'm going to talk about the use of italics and to show tone, right? And I'm also going to talk about how that positions the audience to understand Atticus as a character, what it does for his characterization, why it shows him as an example of a moral and righteous man in this society where there's not a lot of that. Okay, so when I am picking my evidence, it's very important that I'm picking the evidence that shows a stylistic or an aesthetic device, because in this part here, where it says analysis of evidence, I actually have to analyze it and talk about the purpose of it being there and what it does, what impact it has on the reader of my article, or the reader of the text, or the viewer of the film. All right. Now, see where it says repeat above process, right? It's your standard TERL paragraph. Okay. So I might like to do 2 pieces of evidence for To Kill a Mockingbird and then 2 pieces of evidence for The Help. Or I can go 1 for To Kill a Mockingbird, 1 for The Help, and then I might expand upon it and repeat the process again and go To Kill a Mockingbird and The Help again. So this main point here, right, is going to be your body split into 2. Okay, so it's a main point. It's basically a giant TERL paragraph, and we just split it in half by leaving a space in our writing, and then it becomes 2 mini paragraphs that are actually part of one main idea with a TERL structure. Okay, so that main point here, that main paragraph, will be all about courage. Okay, and remember, you're looking at 1,000 to 1,500 words, so you've got a lot of depth here. I would expect that this main point here, you've got about 500 to 600 words. Okay, so you're going to need 2 pieces of evidence for To Kill a Mockingbird, 2 pieces of evidence for your film. You need to analyze and discuss and talk about drawing it back, bringing it back to why it's still relevant today. Now, when you go into your main body or your main point 2, that's where you could be talking about the opposite idea, which is how cowardice is shown in both texts. And obviously, you're talking about cowardice in the face of racism or prejudice or whatever it is you're doing. Okay, if you're choosing courage and cowardice. So you do the same thing, okay, except for cowardice. You find evidence of cowardice in To Kill a Mockingbird, 2 pieces, evidence of cowardice in the film, 2 pieces, and you make sure they are an aesthetic device, okay, because you need to talk about what is the device. Is it a simile? Is it a metaphor? Is it use of italics, use of ellipses? Is it a visual device, particularly in film? Are you looking at camera, lighting, angle, shot type, sound? Are you looking at close-up of facial expression, color selection, symbolism? What do these things do for the viewer to drive the point home that the director is or the writer is trying to make? So the really important thing here when you're analyzing your evidence, which is where the bulk of your mark comes from, is that you talk about how the audience is positioned by using this technique and what impact it has on the viewer. Okay, it's really important. Now, if you want to do a third main point, you can. That's totally fine. If you want to weave throughout both body paragraphs or both main points the connections to today, that's fine. If you would like to have a paragraph at the end discussing how these texts are relevant today and separate it, that's fine. It is your article. Okay, so you need to come at it from a perspective. You need to have a purpose and a reason, and you need to be adding your voice to this conversation. Why do these texts still matter today in 2023? Why do we continue to consume these types of texts that are all about race and privilege and class and, you know, standing up for the underdog? Why are they still appealing to people today? One of the reasons is because these things still exist today. They are still issues and themes that we are grappling with, and you need to make that very clear in your literary essay. Now, your tone of your literary essay needs to be analytical, but also slightly persuasive, because you're trying to convince your reader that these texts still matter. Okay, so you can still put your emotive language in there, you can still put your persuasive techniques in there, but you still need to be analyzing and discussing the evidence to back yourself up. Okay, I think that's enough for now, but hopefully by the end of this video, you have some understanding of the guts of what needs to be in your literary essay, and you can consider, what are my linking big ideas going to be? Just before I sign off, there's a few examples of some other linking big ideas. So you could talk about privilege and disadvantage if you want. You could talk about strength versus weakness, moralities and values, good versus evil. So who are your good characters? Who are your evil characters? You could talk about characters that challenge social norms, characters that show morals and values versus characters who don't. You could talk about the role of class if you wanted to just do class instead, and how that makes a difference to the way that people operate in their society. You could talk about justice and judgment, individual versus society, the impact of friendships on prejudice on friendships, human dignity, social norms, wherever you want to go with it. One of the most important things that you need to make sure you're doing is that you are talking about social norms at the time and how things are, your cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs in both texts. What are they in both texts? How do the characters either reinforce or go against them? What are our cultural assumptions, values, attitudes, and beliefs today, and have they changed? Okay, you need to be talking about that stuff because it is on your task sheet and you are getting graded on it, and it helps you to really understand why these texts are still relevant today. Okay, thanks very much.